At 6:30 in the morning, Pope Leo XIV knelt on the cold tile floor of a forgotten room in Testier. His white cassock gathered around his knees, his hands rested on the edge of a narrow iron bed. And before him lay a priest who had served the church for 73 years without ceremony, without title, and without public thanks. The old man was 102 years old, barely breathing against two thin pillows, and he had no idea the Pope was beside him. There were no cameras in the room. No press pool waited in the hallway. No Vatican spokesperson stood at the door, and no microphone had been placed near the bed. Only the Pope, the old priest, and the quiet smell of camphor and candle wax filled the small second-floor room, while two nuns remained close enough to hear fragments through the thin plaster wall. For nearly 4 minutes, Leo did not speak. He stayed on his knees, holding the skeletal hand of a man whose parish had been closed 11 years earlier, and whose name had never appeared in Vatican honors. The wall clock ticked behind the bed, and the priest's shallow breathing moved through the silence like paper being turned in an empty chapel. When the old priest finally opened his eyes, he did not recognize the face in front of him. Macular degeneration had taken most of his sight years before, leaving only a white blur, a shape, a presence at the edge of his bed. Pope Leo leaned closer and spoke softly as one priest to another. "I am here because the Church owes you a debt it can never repay." The old man blinked, but no answer came. His fingers moved faintly against the Pope's palm, and Leo remained exactly where he was, knees pressed into the floor, refusing the chair beside the bed. He had not come to perform a gesture for Rome. He had come to kneel before the invisible Church. What happened over the next 40 minutes would be known only afterward, carried first by one nun's trembling account, and then through the sealed corridors of Vatican power. But one sentence from that dying priest would reach Pope Leo so deeply that 5 days later he would call an emergency meeting with the dicastery for the clergy. A man the Church had forgotten was about to tell the Pope what the Church still needed to hear. His name does not matter for this story. The Vatican had not released it, and the nuns who cared for him had asked that it remain private. And what mattered was not the name on his baptismal record, but the shape of a life spent almost entirely outside the places where the Church records importance. He was ordained in 1953. The same year, Queen Elizabeth was crowned in London, and the Korean War ended. He was 24 years old, fresh from seminary, and sent to a small parish near the banks of the Tiber River. The church was modest, with stone walls, a leaking roof, and a congregation made up of working families, fishers, lauresses, and men who loaded barges before dawn. He never left that parish. Not for promotion, not for a larger church, not for safer assignment, and not for ambition. In 1971, when his bishop offered him a position in the diocese and curia, he declined because his people needed him, and leaving them felt like betrayal. So he stayed while Rome changed around him. Buildings were torn down and rebuilt. Old families moved toward the suburbs. New immigrants arrived in the neighborhood, learned new languages, new businesses, and new forms of survival. He remained in the same parish, like a fixed point in a turning world. A priest, no one in the Vatican was watching because he had never tried to become visible. For 73 years he said Mass every morning. He heard confessions every Saturday, visited the sick on Tuesdays and Thursdays, buried the dead, married the young, and baptized children who grew old enough to bring their own grandchildren back to the same stone font. 3 full generations passed through his hands. His ministry was not dramatic in the way institutions remember drama. It was repetitive, physical, ordinary, and exact. He unlocked doors before sunrise, lifted the chalice with the same worn hands, walked parish stairwells to reach the sick, and stood beside families when grief made words useless. The neighborhood changed entirely around him. The butcher shops became trauas, then tourist restaurants, and the people who once filled the pews were replaced by others carrying different accents and different burdens. He adapted without announcing adaptation, because a parish priest does not survive by being admired. He survives by remaining. He never wrote a book. He never appeared on television, never gave an interview to a Catholic publication or secular newspaper, and never attended a cund or conference. He was never made a senior, never named a canon, never raised any honorary rank that might have placed his life inside official memory. From 1953 until his forced retirement in 2014, he remained a simple parish priest in the vast hierarchy of the Catholic Church. That many stood on the lowest visible rung and carried one of the heaviest invisible burdens. He had given the Church everything it quietly expects from men, and it rarely stops to think. By 2014, the parish that had held his entire priesthood was merged with another because attendance had declined. The old church was closed for regular services, and the decision arrived with the kind of administrative calm that can make a lifetime sound like a scheduling problem. He stood inside the empty nave after the announcement, his hand resting on the back of a pew, unable for nearly an hour to turn and leave. By 2015, he was technically retired. The retirement did not end the pattern of service that had shaped him. He continued saying Mass privately in a small chapel attached to the residential building, where he lived for the few elderly women who still came. There was no choir, no ceremony, and no notice from the deceased. Only a priest continued because stopping felt impossible. By 2020, even that had ended. His legs could no longer carry him the 12 steps from his bed to the makeshift altar, and the small chapel fell silent. The man who had spent his life walking toward others now could not cross his own room. For the next 6 years, he lived confined to a single room. 2 nuns from a small religious order checked on him daily, cooked his meals, helped him wash, and changed his sheets. A doctor visited once a week. A deacon brought him the Eucharist every Sunday morning. And when his fingers allowed it, he prayed the rosary. He was 102 years old, the oldest living clergyman in the Diocese of Rome, possibly one of the oldest in Italy. Yet the institutional church had forgotten him almost completely. No honor had come, no official gratitude had arrived, and no one in the Vatican had thought to ask what became of a man who had given 73 years without leaving his post. The story of how Pope Leo learned about him began with an ordinary letter. It was not addressed to the Pope, not written for public attention, and not sent to anyone with the power to change policy. Sister Adele, one of the nuns caring for the old priest, wrote to her provincial superior in northern Italy, asking for additional funds to cover his rising medical costs. His medications had changed. He needed a new mattress to prevent bed sores, and the small order budget was already under strain. Near the end of the letter, almost as an aside, Sister Adele mentioned that the priest had been ordained in 1953 and was believed to be the oldest living priest in the Diocese of Rome. She wrote it to justify the expense. A man who had served that long deserved adequate care, but through a chain of administrative forwarding that no one later fully reconstructed, the letter ended up in a stack of routine correspondence on the desk of the Vicar General of Rome. He read it on a Tuesday morning in early June. At first, he put it aside with the other requests. Then something in the detail pulled him back, and he checked the diocese and records against ordination dates from the early 1950s. The priest was real. The ordination was confirmed. 73 years of service, 1 parish, no honors, no recognition, and now 1 small room in Trier, attended by 2 nuns. That afternoon, the Vicar General mentioned it to his secretary. The secretary mentioned it the following day at a routine coordination meeting with officials from the Dicus Testier for the clergy. 3 days later, one Monsignor responsible for clergy welfare briefed the Pope's personal secretary on unrelated matters and added the old priest's case at the end almost as a curiosity. The Pope's secretary made a note and brought it to Leo during the regular evening briefing the following day. It was placed between updates on the diplomatic calendar and a staffing question involving the Secretariat of State. The secretary expected a routine answer, perhaps a papal blessing on parchment, a certificate of appreciation, or instructions to send a formal message through the vicariate. Instead, Pope Leo put down the folder he had been reading. He removed his glasses and looked at his secretary in silence long enough for the room to change. Then he said 4 words that set everything in motion. "I will go myself." The secretary hesitated and suggested that perhaps a representative from the vicariate could visit first. Leo stopped him with a quiet no, the kind that allowed no second version of the same suggestion. A man had given the church 73 years without a single word of thanks, he said, and Dad would go in person. Then he made the meaning unmistakable. The Pope would not arrive as an institution, sending courtesy to an old employee. The Pope would kneel because that was what the church owed a priest who had served without reward. His secretary nodded because he knew that tone and understood there would be no further discussion. What followed became, according to one member of the security detail, one of the most unusual 48 hours of logistical planning in Leo's pontificate. The Pope did not want a motorcade, photographers, journalists, or the full weight of Vatican security, turning a sick room into a spectacle. He wanted to knock on an old man's door like a parish priest visiting the sick. Security protocols made that impossible in pure form. The Bishop of Rome cannot simply walk through his own diocese unannounced even before sunrise. So, a compromise was built quietly. 1 unmarked sedan, 4 piano officers, no media advisory, no advance notice to the building's residents, and no Vatican press office involvement until the Pope was already inside. Sister Adele was contacted 24 hours in advance. She was told only that a senior church official wished to visit the priest the following morning. When she asked which official, she was told she would know when he arrived, and she spent the night cleaning the apartment, changing the sheets, placing fresh flowers in a glass by the bed, and not sleeping. On a Monday morning in late June, just after 6, the Pope's unmarked sedan turned into a narrow street in Test. The engine cut in the blue pre-dawn light, and Leo stepped out wearing a plain white corsage, without the mozzetta, without the stole, and without the visible signs that normally turn a papal movement into an event. From several yards away, he could have been mistaken for any elderly priest arriving for morning mass. He entered through a side door Sister Adele had left unlocked. The staircase was narrow, and he climbed 2 flights slowly because his left knee had been troubling him for months. One of the plainclothed security officers reached out to help, but Leo gently waved the hand away because the effort itself was part of why he had come. On the second floor, Sister Adele waited at the apartment door with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. When she saw him and understood who the visitor was, her body nearly failed her. "Holy Father," she whispered, and the tears came before she could stop them. Leo took one of her hands in both of his. "Please," he said gently, "let us not wake him with tears. Let us wake him with peace." She steadied herself, nodded, and led him down the short hallway. The apartment was small, 3 rooms, and a kitchen barely large enough for one person to stand in. It was clean but sparse, with faded religious images along the walls, a crucifix above every doorway, and photographs of parishioners from the 1960s set in wooden frames. The air carried the smell of camper disinfectant, candle wax, and the older stillness of a life approaching its final chapter. The priest's room was at the end of the hall. The door was open, and he lay asleep, propped against pillows at a slight angle to ease his breathing. His rosary rested loosely across one hand, the beads worn smooth from decades of use, and the hands on the blanket were the hands of a man who had elevated the Eucharist more than 60,000 times. Pope Leo entered the room alone. He stood beside the bed, looked at the old priest's face, then at his hands, and without speaking, lowered himself slowly to his knees on the cold ceramic tile for 4 full minutes. He remained there in silence, placing himself lower than the most forgotten man in the room. When the old priest finally stirred, Pope Leo was still on his knees. The man's clouded eyes opened slowly, struggling to focus on the white shape beside the bed. His vision had been failing for years, and by then he could see only a blur, a presence, something close enough to touch, but not clear enough to recognize. He reached out one trembling hand and touched the fabric of Leo's classic. His fingers moved across it slowly, as if trying to read the person kneeling beside him through cloth. Then he asked in Italian, his voice thin as parchment, "Are you a priest?" "Yes," Pope Leo said softly. "I am a priest." The old man's hand remained on his sleeve, gripping weakly, and after a few seconds he asked, "Which parish?" Leo smiled, small and human, and answered, "A very large one," and the old priest accepted this with a slow nod. He did not understand that the Bishop of Rome was kneeling beside his bed. He only understood that another priest had come into the room, and in that fragile recognition, the visit became exactly what Leo had wanted it to be. Then Leo spoke the words Sister Adele would later repeat for the rest of her life. "Father, I have not come to give you a blessing. I have come to ask for yours, because you have done what I can only hope to do." He kept holding the old man's hand and told him he had served without reward, without recognition, and without ceasing for 73 years, and that the Church owed him everything it had never given. The priest stared at him. The clock continued ticking on the wall, and for a moment the room seemed to wait for his mind to catch the weight of what had been said. His mouth opened slightly, and his clouded eyes filled with tears. "I only did what I was asked to do," he whispered. "Nothing special, nothing more." Leo stayed on his knees and answered with quiet force, telling him that this was exactly what made it extraordinary, because the Church stood on the backs of men who did what they were asked and never demanded applause. For the next 30 minutes, Pope Leo remained beside the bed. He helped the old priest sit higher against the pillows, held a glass of water to his cracked lips, and asked about the parish, the years, and the people he remembered. The old man's memory moved in fragments, but inside those fragments were pieces of a hidden history Rome had never recorded. The old priest remembered a flood in 1966 that had pushed brown water through the lower walls of his church. His voice grew clearer as he described winging through the neighborhood with a cornium held above his head, carrying communion to parishioners trapped on upper floors. Pope Leo listened without interrupting, his hand still close enough to steady the glass if the old man needed water again. He remembered a boy he had baptized in 1961. Decades later, that boy became a cardiac surgeon and saved the priest's life during a heart episode in 1984. The old man told the story slowly, confusing a few details, but not the boy's face, not the hospital room, and not the strange mercy of a child once baptized returning as the doctor who kept him alive. He remembered the day his parish was closed in 2014. The bishop's exact words had stayed with him, even when other decades had begun to blur. After the announcement, he stood alone inside the empty nave for 1 hour with his hand on the back of a pew, physically unable to turn and walk out the door. There were lighter fragments, too. He remembered a cat wandering onto the altar during Easter Mass in 1978, and for a moment, Pope Leo laughed softly beside the bed. Then the room grew quiet again, because beneath every memory was the same unspoken fact. This man had carried an entire parish through history, and almost none of it had been written down. Leo was not interviewing him. He was receiving him. One old priest sat beside another old priest, listening to the remains of a life that had never asked to be important, and had therefore become almost invisible to the institution it served. Then came the moment that changed everything. Pope Leo, still close to the bed, leaned forward and asked the old priest for his blessing. Not a public blessing, not a ceremonial gesture, but a priest's blessing from one servant of the church to another. The room went completely silent. Behind the wall, Sister Adele pressed both hands over her mouth. The old priest looked toward the white blur beside him, and something crossed his face that was not confusion anymore. It was recognition. Not recognition of the Pope's face, because his eyes could not give him that, but recognition of the moment itself. Something old and deeply formed inside him seemed to rise through the weakness of his body. He lifted his right hand. It trembled badly. Pope Leo bowed his head until his forehead nearly touched the mattress, and the priest made the sign of the cross over him with the same Latin formula he had spoken over countless people in doorways, hospitals, chapels, and parish rooms for 7 decades. Then, after the formula ended, the old priest added one sentence. His voice was so faint that Sister Adele heard only fragments through the wall, but Leo heard it fully because his head was only inches from the old man's lips. When the Pope finally lifted his head, tears were running down his face. For 30 seconds, Leo could not speak. His jaw tightened, his hand shook, and he rested one hand on the old priest's thin shoulder as the room absorbed what had just been given. Later that evening, he would tell his secretary the exact words, "I forgive you, not you, the church. For every priest like me, it is forgotten. I forgive it. Tell them I said that it was accusation and absolution in the same breath." The old priest had every right to bitterness. Yet, in what may have been the last consequential moment of his life, he gave the Pope mercy and a command, "Tell them I said that." Pope Leo stayed in the room for another full minute after the old priest spoke. He pressed the priest's hand to his own forehead and whispered something no one else heard. Then he stepped back from the bed and walked into the hallway, carrying the sentence with him, as if it had become heavier than the room itself. Sister Adele was waiting against the wall, weeping openly. The other nun stood beside her, frozen by what she had heard and by what she had not fully understood. Leo stopped, took Sister Adele's hands in his, and looked directly into her face. "Thank you," he said, his voice raw, "for taking care of the best of us, the very best of us." Sister Adele could not answer. She only nodded while tears fell onto their joined hands. The Pope descended the stairs slowly, holding the railing. His security team formed around him in silence at the ground floor, and no one spoke as he, for the entire 15-minute drive back through Rome. He remained quiet, looking out the window as the city began to wake. His secretary glanced back at once in the rearview mirror. Pope Leo's hands were folded in his lap, and his face was still wet. The morning light caught the tracks of tears on his cheeks, but he did not speak until they were inside the Vatican walls. When he stepped out of the car in the courtyard of the Apostolic Palace, he turned to his secretary and gave the first instruction. He wanted a meeting with the dicker for the clergy that same week. He wanted a complete review of how the church recognized priests who had served 50 years or more. Not certificates, not letters, something the whole church could see. Then he added one more instruction before walking inside. Fresh flowers were to be sent to that room every week from him personally until God called the old priest home. The secretary nodded, and Leo moved through the colonnades past the Swiss guards into the silence of the Apostolic Palace, carrying one sentence from Testier into the center of Vatican power. In the days that followed, no official statement was released about the visit. The Vatican press office did not confirm it, deny it, or place it into the public record. But the story moved through Rome the way stories inside the church often move, quietly, indirectly, and with enough detail that silence could no longer contain it. Sister Adele told her provincial superior. Her superior told the community. A man senior in the dictionary for the clergy confirmed that Pope Leo had requested an urgent meeting about clergy recognition, and a retired member of the Pope's security detail confirmed the date and the trusted neighborhood to an Italian Catholic journalist. The old priest continued to sleep most of the day. He continued to receive the Eucharist on Sundays and hold his rosary when his fingers permitted. Sister Adele reported that after the visit, something in him seemed calmer, as if a weight he had never named had finally been placed into the hands of someone who could carry it beyond that room. 73 years of priesthood had not been repaid by 40 minutes on a cold floor. No single visit could undo decades of institutional blindness, and no private gesture could return the honors that never came. But it was a beginning, and Pope Leo had not left trusted with only emotion. He had left with a command. The priest had forgiven the church for forgetting men like him. Then he told the Pope to tell them that sentence moved from a narrow bed and stride into the machinery of the Vatican. And once it entered Leo's hands, it became impossible to leave it as a beautiful memory. The next step was already being prepared. Somewhere inside the dicastery for the clergy, officials were about to review how the church sees the priests who spent half a century serving without applause. The forgotten had been named, the Pope had knelt, and Rome had been given a message it could not easily ignore. Tell them I said that.